Good evening. Before I introduce Sylvia Lavin, who will be introducing tonight's speaker, I just wanted to remind you that next week Zaha Hadid introduce Sylvia Lavin, who will be introducing. Good evening. Before I introduce Sylvia Lavin, who will be introducing tonight's speaker, I just wanted to remind you that next week Zaha Hadid will be lecturing on Tuesday, not Wednesday, Tuesday at 8 o'clock in this same space. Get here early. And I would like to introduce Sylvia Lavin, assistant professor at UCLA and an instructor here at SciArc, where she, together with Christian Hubert, is teaching the Weird Science course. And Sylvia will introduce tonight's lecturer.
This super formality of introducing the introducers somehow seems out of keeping, but thanks, Aaron. It has not infrequently been claimed that architecture, in the past decade or so, transformed itself into a voracious parasite which attempted to salvage its own professional existence by vampirizing the intellectual life's blood from other disciplines of thought and practice. The result, according to some critics, was not so much the leaving of invaded fields such as linguistics, literary criticism, or the whole of post-structuralism drained and lifeless, but leaving architecture itself with little to do but crawl into its coffin as the light of a new age dawned. There are those who are already preparing their arguments to assert that architecture's current interest in recent developments in science and technology is just another of these faddish and feckless sorties that will lead the profession only further and deeper into its own grave. There are thinkers, however, who are currently undoing the various logical orders that make such proclamations possible, for they are reconceptualizing the conventional distinctions we draw between what is alive and what is not, and are thus transforming what might constitute the idea of a life's blood, who are reshaping the difference between what we make and what makes us, and thus potentially between the real and the virtual, and who are reconfiguring the perceptible landscape from one structured along a vertical and hierarchical axis into one conceived as a horizontal network characterized above all by intimate connections between previously thought to be incommensurable elements. Manuel De Landa, a filmmaker and software designer who's best known to us here at the school as the author of War in the Age of Intelligent Machines and of the essay on inorganic life published in the recent issue of Zone, is one of those thinkers. His work, which seeks and establishes relationships between the sciences of complexity, artificial life, critical theory, and particularly the philosophy of Deleuze, as well as transformations in contemporary electronic technology, is in the process of redefining what might constitute a proper history of the human by improperly associating it with the evolution of the machinic and the inorganic. As we see De Landa producing a body of ideas that navigates through and around traditional disciplinary and material distinctions, we may well also see the opening up of new possibilities for thinking through the coordinates of our own existences and practices. His presence here at SciArc is therefore not necessarily another example of architecture's need to compensate for its own loss of ground and direction by relying on unnecessary and distracting prosthetics, but an example of one of those new possible connections and emerging tools for thought that arise when doors, whether architectural, institutional, or indeed virtual, are opened up rather than shut down. SciArc would like to welcome Manuel De Landa, and there will be questions. He'll take questions after the lecture if anybody has any.
Thank you very much. I spent most of the day today with a class. We were discussing virtual reality applications and so on. And I would like to relate this to what we talked about today. The title of this lecture could be something like Virtual Environments as Intuition Synthesizers. And that sort of like explains what the lecture is going to be about. I'm not going to be talking about virtual reality per se. What I do for a living in New York is I do 3D modeling and animation, and perhaps I'm a little jaded because I've been in creating virtual objects for many, many years, and so I don't find virtual reality that exciting. Certainly not the gadgety part with the helmet and all that stuff. I find it very gimmicky. However, virtual environments as an instrument of thought more than entertainment is to me or will become a revolution. The most concrete example of virtual environments used to generate ideas and to generate new intuitions is, of course, artificial life, and I will be focusing mostly on this discipline, although, as you will see as I explain to you what I'm going to be talking about, the ideas that you generate by doing artificial life experiments can be applied to a variety of disciplines. I will try to link these ideas a little bit to architecture, but also I would like to link him a little bit to linguistics and to economics and to other disciplines that right now have been virtually untouched by the use of virtual environments. So the very first thing that we must understand is that one cannot profit from this, well, I would call it an epistemological reservoir, these virtual environments as intuition synthesizers, by simply transforming our old ideas into algebraic form and then feeding them into the computer in the form of computer programs and then running a simulation. To do that would be essentially not to do anything at all. To actually profit from the use of virtual environments, one needs to change the very ideas that one brings into the thing. And that's why artificial life is the perfect example. In order to understand what artificial life is all about, one needs first to understand two key concepts, two key new ways of thinking that have emerged in this century. The very first one is called population thinking. Population thinking was invented or created or discovered in the 1930s when the theories of evolution of Darwin were married to the theories of genetics. I'll explain exactly what population thinking is. The second key idea is, and this is more novel, is nonlinear dynamics. A lot of you probably are familiar with it in terms of chaos theory or fractals and so on. But again, there's a lot of hype around these things, and we need to sort of like, we need the naked concepts. We need to peel the onion of all the hype and get to the core of what's important here. Okay, so let's start with population thinking. Perhaps the best way of understand this revolutionary concept that it's only 60 years old is to think of how people before Darwin thought about animal species. The paradigm to think about what an animal species was, or a plant species for that matter, came directly from the Greeks, and normally it's called the Aristotelian Paradigm. So the way in which we used to think about species was roughly this. You have zebras, bunches of zebras there. You have tigers, you have giraffes and hippopotamus and so on. Now let's take zebras as an example. What the Greeks used to think, and we used to think up to Darwin, was that there was an ideal type, an ideal zebra that embodied all the perfect, like the essence of zebrahood, just exactly what it is to be a zebra, right? And the actual zebras you saw on the wild or you saw in a zoo were just more or less imperfect incarnations of that perfect essence of a zebra. So for the old way of thinking, what was real was this abstract essence, and what was not real was all the variation we see in the world. All this variation concealed to us the existence of this essence of the zebra. Now, what population thinking did was to turn this exactly upside down. What happens now, instead of thinking that there was an ideal zebra, it was realized that all the different traits of the zebra, its camouflage, its hoofs, its speed, its eating habits, may have evolved along very different lineages of animals, and they just happen to come together through the action of natural selection. Natural selection acted as some kind of tinkering agent, and it put together the hoofs, it put together the camouflage, and bingo, there came out a zebra. Therefore, there was not an ideal model of a zebra pre-existing all this thing. A zebra is simply just a tinkered contraption of different traits that may have evolved along different lines that happen to come together into zebras, but that may not have come together. Therefore, there was nothing necessary about this particular shape to appear. Now, what population thinking did was to actually turn this upside down by saying, okay, now let me just add one more thing. How is it possible that all these traits had come together to form a zebra? Well, the basic idea is that you have tons of zebras, a population of zebras, each one with a little bit of variation, varying from one another a tiny little bit, and that provides the raw material for natural selection to pick. And we'll debunk this other idea, but let's call it right now the fittest, although that's, again, another myth. And the basic idea is that you have variation that over many generations gets filtered out, and over many generations only certain traits accumulate or sediment or come together in the form of a zebra. Therefore, for population thinkers, what's real is the variation, and the average zebra does not exist, which is exactly the opposite of the Aristotelian paradigm. Now, this is a complete new way of thinking, because we always tend to think of things as coming from some kind of archetype. We don't tend to think of actual structures, like the structure of a zebra, as being historical contraptions, as being things that came together historically by a completely unnecessary process, by a process that did not have to happen. It happened, historically happened, but it could have not happened. And instead of zebras, we could have had a totally different animal that had a different pattern of camouflage, that had a different eating habits, a different mating habits, and so on. So the whole idea here is that instead of thinking of structures as something that pre-exists as a pure structure and then becomes incarnated, and therefore the role of humans is to guess what this pure structure is, now everything becomes directly historical. Everything becomes a product of actual happenings, actual history. Anyway, that is the very first idea, and you'll see how it connects with computer simulations and virtual reality in a second. That's the first idea that's key to understand artificial life. The second key idea to understand artificial life is the debunking or the destruction of the idea that the fittest survive. Okay, now we are right now in the context of natural evolution. In the context, when Darwin created this theory, a philosopher called Spencer sort of deduced from his theory that it was only the fittest or the optimal designed that selection would slowly filter out. And therefore, what we saw in zebras was really what the optimal zebra is. What we saw in a population of tigers was the optimal design for a tiger. And they survive, and they are a stable species, a stable structure that survives and remains and stays with us for many, many generations, precisely because they were optimal. Now, the new idea, the one has come to replace this, is that there are other forms there are other ways in which a particular structure, the structure of a zebra, the structure of a tiger, to acquire a stability that does not necessarily imply that they are optimal. And in order to do this, I need to go a little bit around and go into other disciplines to explain to you what these new forms of stability are. In the 19th century, the only concept of stability that existed was the stability of thermodynamics, heat death. You know, things become stable because if you have a very ordered set of elements, as the energy as they interact and their useful energy becomes exhausted, everything becomes heat, everything dies, and that's the ultimate equilibrium, death. In the last few decades, it has been discovered that if instead of thinking of thermodynamics in terms of closed systems, if instead of that you think of it as any structure that exists on Earth being traversed by flows of matter and energy, therefore new forms of stabilization become possible. Let me give you a very concrete example of this. Planet Earth is just a reservoir of materials, of 92 elements. Of all the possible elements, only 92 are stable under these conditions, so only 92 occur naturally on Earth. At the same time, being a reservoir of materials is traversed by a flow of solar energy, and it gives out heat towards outer space. So basically, thinking about it as a dynamical system, planet Earth is just a bowl of materials with a very strong flow of energy going through one side and a flow of useless energy going out through the other side. The moment you have this setup, and this setup can be anything. It can be a species in an ecosystem in which the form of energy is the flesh or biomass that flows in the form of, through food chains. Predators eat prey, bigger predators eat these predators, and so on. And so the flesh, the biomass, the jelly stuff, flows through ecosystems, and that is the energy that's coming in and out of the system. The moment you start thinking of structures as being traversed by flows of matter and energy, a bunch of new possibilities arise as to how these structures can stabilize themselves. One of the forms in which they can stabilize themselves is, for instance, a cycle. Instead of being a static form of equilibrium, instead of being a static form of stability, a cycle gives you stability, but in a periodic way. Another form of stability that's new that we didn't know about is chaos. Chaos that you've read plenty. I mean, there's been all these books about chaos. The actual name of chaos is deterministic chaos. That is, it's something that has to happen, but at the same time, it's like a form of stability that forces you to be creative, that forces you to explore a small set of dynamical possibilities over and over and over again. So instead of the old notions of stability as a static thing, which still economists still use, we right now have a plethora, a big menu of new forms of stability that are possible if you start thinking of structures in terms of flows of matter and energy. Now let me try to make this a little more concrete. One of the things that these new forms of stability permit is what is called emergent properties, properties of a whole that are not possessed by its parts in isolation, or properties of the whole that are more than the sum of its parts. We know this as synergy. Sometimes it's Buckminster Fuller. We know this as synergy, but it goes by different names. And this idea of an emergent property used to be considered kind of like mystical until nonlinear dynamics came along, until these new forms of stability were discovered. Let me give you a very concrete example just to show you how novel this was. Not that long ago, in the 1950s, a Russian chemist called Belousov mixed two chemicals into a vat. Let's say that one was red and the other one was blue. Doesn't really matter. Normally, if you think of static stability, you would think that these billions of molecules would have just combined with each other and formed some kind of purple mixture, and then the purple mixture would have come to an equilibrium. That's, like total randomness. Instead of that, this guy pours the things in, and under the right temperature and so on conditions, the whole vat started pulsing by itself, red, blue, to a perfect beat. Now, he had discovered, and we're talking about the 1950s, a chemical clock, the self-assembly of a chemical clock. He had discovered that molecules that obviously don't have minds to be following each other could somehow act in concert if a cyclic form of stability possessed them, so to speak. And the whole thing started, it became a self-assembled clock. Now, this was such an outrageous idea in the 1950s that the guy didn't get to publish his essays or papers or anything. It was not only until Ilya Prigogine explain to the world mathematically how this could happen as long as you allowed a flow of energy to go through the system, that it became a normal thing. Now everybody knows that chemical clocks exist, and now in fact they know that the clocks we have inside ourselves, the clock that governs our going to sleep and awaking, the clock that governs our temperature cycle, the menstrual cycle, the monthly cycle, or even yearly cycles are governed by self-assembled chemical clocks inside of. They are not the same substances that Belousov discovered. They are made out of enzymes and other proteins, but they are self-assembled clocks. The whole point now is that what was discovered, I mean, well, in this case, obviously the emergent property of the vat was that it became a clock. There was nothing in the individual properties of the molecules that could possibly account for this behavior. They began acquiring a collective identity or a collective behavior because they were, on the one hand, traversed by a flow of energy and matter, and on the other hand, because they were stabilized non-linearly. Now, the technical term for this, what stabilizes a chemical clock is an attractor, which is called that way because it obviously attracts the dynamics of a system to a particular state. There are static attractors or point attractors, which make everything freeze and be in a static equilibrium. There are periodic attractors, which make things cycle by themselves, make inert matter pulse, inert matter breathe in a way. There are chaotic attractors, which do the same thing, only with much more creativity to the periodic beat. For instance, it has been shown that our heartbeat, in fact, is governed by a chaotic attractor. That, in fact, when you are about to have a heart attack or when you have a heart disease, it becomes periodic. We tend to think of the heartbeat as being a perfect beat, but in fact, it's not. It's a beat with small variations in it, which makes it much more adaptable to shocks, makes it much more adaptable to actually living inside a wet body with many possibilities of malfunction. So chaotic attractors, and that's the key thing, is a form of stabilization that allows inherent variability and adaptability in systems. So anyway, let me summarize so we can go on. So we have on the one hand the idea that essences do not exist, and that in fact any structure you see out there, whether it's an animal species, whether it's a linguistic structure such as English, whether it's an economic structure such as capitalism, or whether it's a structure in a typical sense of an assemblage of materials that supports loads, such as in architecture, any structure is a historical product. That's the first idea. The second idea is that historically produced structures come to be what they are because they become stabilized by attractors of the different types. In other words, that there is in the very flow of matter and energy the possibility of generating order out of chaos, of generating structures out of nowhere. And out of that possibility of the flows of matter and energy of just generating order by themselves, then comes selection and other processes that shapes them into what they are. Now, this is crucial to understand artificial life, because in artificial life, all you do is create very, very simple definitions of very, very simple animals. Can be abstract virtual insects or, virtual amoebas, very simple animals, and throw a whole population of them into the computer and then see what happens. In other words, the main point of an artificial life experiment is that emergent properties should occur in populations, properties that the designer did not put in. One of the perfect examples, of course, comes from the work of Ray Thomas, who was the very first one who designed a little computer program that reproduced itself. The little program was not particularly magic or anything. It was just a program whose assembly language instructions caused it to create a replica of itself without the need for, to steal computer time such as viruses do. So this was like a completely self-contained, self-replicating little program. And of course, again, the key thing here is to think populations. You have to throw a bunch of these programs into the computer. You have to allow them to replicate with enough variability, that is, they have to be little mutations here and there, so that there's raw materials for natural selection to occur. And so what he did is one day he took his little assembly language programs, made a population of them, and put them in the computer, went to sleep. The following day, he woke up and found that there was a new program, a program that he had not written, a program that was half the length of the original program, and it was like a parasite. It had evolved by itself completely. It used the bigger programs that Ray Thomas had designed to reproduce itself. And so, again, the point here was that he came back one day and found a creature that he hadn't put in there. In more ambitious experiments, even weirder things have happened. You put, for instance, 4 or 5 species of self-replicating programs. One is a plant, the other one is a herbivore, which feeds on the plant, the other one is a carnivore, which feeds on the herbivore, and so on. So you have a little bit of an ecosystem with a little bit of a food chain going. A couple of days later, there'll be a new species filling a niche that wasn't filled by the original design. A couple of days later, there'll be 2 or 3 new species, and one of the original ones has already dropped out, has become extinct. 7 days or 2 weeks later, all this, that you have a complete ecosystem that's perfectly integrated, and in which energy and matter, virtual energy and matter, is flowing through the system, and none of the original creatures are there anymore. And the ecosystem has achieved stability through an attractor. Now that's shocking, because again, you are evolving things. You are not, in other words, it would be completely uninteresting if the designer put 7 or 8 little animals and everything that they do was pretty much predictable in advance. The whole idea is to be shocked and surprised by what happens in the virtual environment. That's why I call them intuition synthesizers, because the designer has no idea this is going to happen. When it happens, he gets shocked. Then he goes into the program to figure out just exactly what happened, and that sort of brings out intuition in him. Now, let me just give you another example that makes all this a little more concrete. So we have on the one hand the idea that a population with variation plus a biasing force, any kind of selection force, anything that breeds some but doesn't breed something else, as long as you couple variation with selection, you have something of a probing head or a probing device that explores a world pre-structured by attractors, and this probing device finds assemblages that are stable, and they last for a certain amount of time, they become extinct, and then this probing device by itself finds other assemblages. Now, that this idea is not outrageous is made clear by the fact that this has already been incorporated into software design. The so-called genetic algorithm, designed by a computer scientist, last name is Holland, does exactly that. He has, for instance, a regular programmer would be, like imagine that you're a programmer and someone comes to you and says, well, I need a sorting program. I have a bunch of files. Of course, no one would ask you that because there are sorting programs already. You can just buy them on the store, but let's assume that this was like 10 years ago when you couldn't buy these things. And so I need a sorting program to sort my files in alphabetical order or in this or that, any problem. They specify a problem. Now, the regular way of going about this is a designer of the software goes, okay, so this is the task. I subdivide the task into subtasks, and now I write little programs for each one of the subtasks, and now I have my program. I designed it from scratch. What Holland's genetic algorithm does is it has a bunch of generic little programs in populations that reproduce with variation, and then he, or the programmer in this case, acts as a breeder. Just as a regular human breeder would select certain properties of the dog until the dog becomes a one particular race and not other particular race, and this happens over many generations, and he just crosses the ones that happen to have the traits he wants, and then lets the offspring come out, and now the trait has become a little more condensed, and now he just marries the ones that have the trait more strongly in them, and so he's selecting a certain trait. He's in a way tinkering with the fleshy stuff that makes up the animal, so that certain traits are kept and certain traits are lost. The same thing happens here. The genetic algorithm allows the programmer, and again, it's a matter of populations, it's population thinking, a population of programs that are generic problem solvers are thrown into a soup and then allowed to reproduce over many generations, and the programmer just keeps steering this process towards the solution of one particular problem. So in other words, programmers now are capable of breeding solutions to a problem instead of designing solutions for a problem. Now that to me is also a very amazing idea. I mean, it's something that we really didn't know could happen. We didn't really know that simply by coupling variation with selection, you could actually come up with this steering device, or rather probing device that can probe the space of possible dynamical combinations of traits and come up with stable ones. And again, this can apply to everything. Normally, and let me just give you an example from a different field. Normally when we think of something like English, well, English is a pretty, we don't see it changing in our lifetimes or anything, so we think of it as a pretty stable structure. If we've read Chomsky or Saussure, we even more think of it as a completely stable structure that has never changed. Obviously, that's ridiculous. All you had to do is read Shakespeare to know that, in fact, it has changed. But the most important part is this. How did English was born, for instance? Well, it was a soup of Anglo-Saxon Germanic languages over 1,000 years ago that invaded England and then created this soup of languages very different from each other. They got invaded by Vikings, and so they incorporated a few elements from Scandinavian languages. Then the Normans invaded them, which is carrying the French language with them, and the peasants of England, in about 200 years, from the year 900 to the year 1100, roughly, trying to resist the imposition of French by the Norman invaders, it effectively transformed what was a soup of Germanic languages into something that we could recognize as English today. Now, so in other words, the English grammar came into being through historical processes. It doesn't exist in some part of the brain, or it's not like a set of rules that, it's not like Chomsky or Saussure have been trying to tell us it is. It is an active thing. The only problem is that, of course, it changes over many generations, and we don't notice the changes. They are extremely slow. Now, in the future, it is possible that linguists will have to test their theories in virtual environments. They will have to put a bunch of peasants with a particular Germanic grammar, put a selection pressure, or in this case, a counter-selection pressure by the Normans, and see if something like the syntax of English emerges by itself. If something like the syntax of English becomes an emergent property stabilized by attractors. A similar thing happens in economics. Economics today is still thinking in terms of the all thermodynamic concepts of the 19th century. Still, everything is supposed to be stabilized to a static form of equilibrium in which demand and supply cancel each other out perfectly. As we can see right now from this recession, that is not happening. And that is because economic systems also are structures produced through populations, in this case populations of organizations, populations of firms or businesses, in which, again, through the action of small amounts of variation and a selection pressure, they become stabilized. One theory that tries to explain why we are into this recession right now, called the Contra cycle theory, tells you that, in fact, from the start of the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century, there has been, if you analyze the history of prices, for instance, the history of price of cotton or of corn or of any commodity that's like standard enough, there's a wave. It takes 20 years to go up, 10 years plateau, 20 years to go down. And that is lasts exactly 50 years. And it has happened 4 times in a row. The last time we were in the down part, we're in the 30s. We are not right now in the down part of the Contra-TF wave. precisely when it was supposed to happen. Now, going back to the virtual environments, an MIT team of economists a few years ago, they didn't even know about the Contra TF wave. They hadn't even read, because the Contra TF wave has become a kind of like a mystical thing, and so like no one believes in it. However, these people put a population of organizations in their virtual environment without thinking Contra TF wave, interacting. They made it extremely realistic, cranked up the thing, and I just ran the simulation, and the population began pulsing with a 50-year cycle. Now again, this is the type of thing that the designers did not put in, that they were completely shocked by, and that whether this proves that the Contra TF theory is true or not is a different matter. But the point here is, again, that these virtual environments can become intuition synthesizers, can become something that unblocks certain ways of thinking and reveals new ways of thinking. And of course, again, it's not like they reveal the truth. In artificial intelligence and artificial life experiments, all you do is generate new intuitions so that you can actually design better experiments to generate better intuitions, to design better experiments to generate better intuitions. So it's really just an intuition synthesizer, not, but again, what you're using is this probing device to probe the world, to probe a virtual world and find ideas, which to me is like a very, very different mode of thinking than the rational analytic mode of thinking. It's more like a synthetic mode of thinking. In other words, if you do analysis, you do dissection, you dissect things. But if emergent properties are properties of the whole, not possessed by the parts, the moment you break something up into its parts, you lose the emergent properties. There's nothing left except for like a ghost of that thing. And then you try to put them back together in a rational way, and the emergent properties are not going to come out by themselves. What virtual environments allow for the first time is precisely to put populations of very simple creatures and then watch the properties emerge by themselves. That is, you are synthesizing the properties. You're going in the exact opposite direction. Instead of being top down, which is the analytical way, you start with the whole, dissect it, and go towards the parts. Here you start with very simple parts and synthesize the whole. So it's a completely different direction. And I'll give you some examples right now, concrete examples of how this can unblock certain intuitions. For example, let me give you one example that has to do with military problems, called the prisoner's dilemma. As probably you already know this, I'm going to repeat it anyway, just so that everybody knows what I'm talking about. The prisoner's dilemma is the name of a particular experiment or a particular situation in game theory. Game theory is a mathematical theory that that studies situations where there are conflicts of interest. They reduce it down to the very basics, and it's probably not the best theory to study conflicts of interest, but it's an interesting one. It certainly it lends itself to this kind of population thinking. In the early 1950s, after World War II had proved the worth of scientific thinking in war. I mean, World War II was the very first war where scientists were either shanghaied or recruited en masse to solve strategic, logistic, and tactical problems. After the war, it was obvious to the military here and elsewhere that scientists had to become part of the war machine, a permanent part of the war machine. And that's how think tanks came into being. The very first think tank, which was a mathematician's think tank, was the RAND Corporation. The prisoner's dilemma situation was invented as a game theoretic situation at the RAND Corporation in the early 50s to try to conceptualize the nuclear, sort of like the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The prisoner's dilemma basically goes like that. It's an imaginary situation, but I'll show you how it connects to nuclear proliferation in a second. The idea is that two prisoners get caught for the same crime and brought to jail, put in separate rooms, and offered separately the following deal. You can either betray your partner and say he was the one who committed the crime, or you can claim innocence and not betray your partner. The catch is this. If you betray your partner and he doesn't betray you, if he plays the honest and you play the betrayer, then you walk out free. If both betray one another, they both get a long sentence. If neither one betrays the other, they get a medium-sized sentence. And in the case in which one betrays and the other one doesn't, this one walks out free and this one gets the sucker payoff, which is like the stiffest sentence. Now, precisely because they know that both are going to betray each other, if both betray each other, they get the long sentence. So their best bet would be not to betray each other, but to get the medium-sized sentence. That would be the collective good. That would be what would be best for both of them. But because neither can trust the other, and they don't want to get stuck with the sucker's payoff, they both betray one another, and they both get long sentences. It's kind of a paradoxical situation. Now, how does this translate into nuclear weapons? The best deal for both nations would have been to disarm right there. But neither one wanted to get stuck with the sucker's payoff, nuclear annihilation, so both of them built up their nuclear arsenals, which was in fact worse than having disarmed, as the Soviet Union just found out that when it ran out of steam in the arms race, just couldn't keep up. However, the prisoner dilemma logic seemed to be so analytically correct that the idea that bad guys finish last became entrenched in the military think tanks and in academic circles, for that matter. In other words, you cannot just be a nice guy. If the other person has a better payoff for being a betrayer, he's going to go for it. So you might as well go for it too, and both get the long sentence. So the moral of the story seemed to be good guys finish last. This idea became so entrenched for many years that everybody thought that was like the only thing that can happen in this kind of situation. So a political scientist named Axelrod decided to run a virtual environment simulation to see if this was actually true or not. Again, we're talking about synthesizing an intuition, something that had become blocked by the entrenchment of a particular idea. Good guys finish last. So he decided to invite many theoreticians around the country who had written articles on prisoner's dilemma, ask them to send prisoner dilemma playing little programs, and he was going to get all those programs to work against one another. That is, to play prisoner's dilemma in a round robin kind of a tournament. Okay, one more thing I forgot to say. When there is a different situation of the prisoner's dilemma, which is not a one-shot deal, like in the case of the prisoners, but an iterated version. Imagine the situation can be imagined as follows. Two jungle traders that are a very primitive form of trade. One has bananas, the other one has axes, and so they trade bananas for axes. However, the situation is such that they never really see each other. They just leave a bag of bananas on day one. The following day, the guy with the axes comes in, leaves the bag of axes, and takes the bag of bananas. Now, every time the guy with the axes comes in, he's playing prisoner's dilemma. If I right now just take the bananas and don't leave the axes, I get the best payoff. And I stick the other guy with the sucker's payoff. However, the difference here is that because the situation is iterated, goes over and over and over again, if you do that, you endanger the whole trading situation, and there's more to lose by being a betrayer. However, regardless of that, the idea that good guys finish last was entrenched, and they thought that even in that situation, your best bet, your most rational thing to do was to betray the partner. So Axelrod decides to run an iterated version of the prisoner's dilemma with a bunch of little programs trading with one another. Because the idea that good guys finish last was so entrenched, most of the programs that programs all over the country sent were betrayer programs, were mean programs. A few idealists out there, there's never a shortage of idealists, sent soccer programs. You know, the ones that, okay, you betray me, I don't care, I'll keep trading with you. This one game theoretician named Rappaport sent the simplest program of all. I mean, some of the programs that people sent were like long, and they would calculate and make elaborate calculations to try to really stick the other one with a sucker's payoff and so on. He just sent a program that was this big, a few assembly line instructions long, that was called tit for tat. What tit for tat did was, it was like nice forgiving but retaliating. I'll explain to you what that is. It was nice because on its first encounter with other program, it would always show a sign of good faith and leave the bananas in. It's like he wanted to start a trading situation, so he would show a sign of good faith, so it was nice. It was retaliating because if you betrayed him once, he would try to stick you with a sucker's payoff. It doesn't matter what. In other words, he would go after you. He would retaliate. However, after he got his revenge, he would be forgiving. He was like, you know, he said, okay, now we're even, so let's start the trading situation again. Now, no one before the virtual environment simulation was run gave any chances to tit for tat to win, certainly not to the other soccer programs, and everyone thought that one of the mean programs was going to win. As it happens, tit for tat won. Tit for tat won because, very simple, the mean programs at first grew in this virtual environment. They reproduced themselves and they were bigger, or they were making more profits because they were taking advantage of the suckers. But then when they ran out of suckers to trade with, and they began betraying one another, they didn't have any more trading to do. And tit for tat just profited little by little, until in the end it won. Now Axelrod is sort of like the guy who put the two chemical substances and saw them going like that. This guy went like, what? You know, he couldn't believe tit for tat had won, so he replayed the tournament, wrote a letter to everybody that had sent programs saying, tit for tat won, so good guys don't finish last after all. So why don't you write a program that takes advantage of tit for tat and let's run the tournament again. So again, most people sent mean programs, and again, tit for tat won. After having generated this intuition within himself, Axelrod went ahead and through analysis, after having synthesized the intuition, and through analysis, he proved why tit for tat wins. But he wouldn't have done that. He wouldn't have get to do that unless he had actually synthesized the intuition to begin with. Because again, the idea that good guys finish last was so entrenched that no one could think in any other way. It was like blinders. You couldn't see that there was other possibilities. Now, how many of those blinders do we have in many other areas of thought? I'm sure we have many. For one thing, people before realizing that population thinking was true kept thinking in terms of essences. To this day, there are philosophers out there who believe in essences, who believe that there is a Platonic world where the perfect zebra is, and all the zebras we see out there are just imperfect realizations of that perfect thing. So that idea also had become entrenched, and Darwinism did not dislodge it from this position right away. We needed artificial life, and we needed the genetic algorithm to prove that this was not only a good idea, but that it could actually be profited from. That is, that you could actually breed programs, good programs, by taking advantage of the fact that if you couple variation with selection, you have a probing device. And by taking advantage of the fact that the world is in a way pre-structured by attractors, so that therefore that there are stable solutions out there to be found. Now, we had no idea that neither of these two things existed until very recently, and what virtual environments are making possible is precisely to synthesize more and more ideas in that direction, to allow the machine to be a kind of a probing head into a world that we don't see because we have these blinders on. Now let me just give you another example of the same thing. Again, we're talking about the difference between designing something top down analytically or bottom up. In artificial intelligence, even though at its birth in the 1960s, there were some attempts to do bottom-up design, because we in this century, we have been so obsessed with symbols and semiotics and signifiers and da-da-da, that all we can think of is, oh, well, we think with symbols. And so artificial intelligence, what is called classical artificial intelligence, is just that. You have a computer, you put symbols in it, can be rules, can be programs, can be recipes, can be anything but in symbolic form, and you're supposed to try to get intelligence out of the machine. Of course, after many, many years, well, the very first thing that happened was that they tried to put symbols that were logical symbols, or symbols and logical rules to manipulate those symbols, because they were still thinking humans are, the essence of humans is to be rational animals. So yeah, we get all the mistakes combined into just one big phrase. And so if the essence of humans is to be rational animals, then therefore, if we already discovered the laws of logic, what should we do? Let's put signifiers, symbols into the machine, give them some logical rules to manipulate those symbols, and intelligence should emerge. Come on. Nothing. Nothing emerged. Up to the 1960s, of course, there was a chess playing machine in very, very circumscribed environments. They did perform well. I mean, because chess, after all, is just a matter of applying rules and so on. But, doing a brute force look ahead strategies in which you look ahead of the consequence of a particular move much faster than any human can, and so you win against the humans. You can't win against a grandmaster who's using intuition to immediately discard a million possible combinations and just see the ones that really work. But the computers could really beat very good amateurs. And so they thought, wow, we've got something here. Then by the 1970s, it became obvious that humans are not rational animals, that when we're confronted with a problem, we do not immediately think logically, but that in fact, most of the time we think heuristically, that is, via rules of thumb, accumulated experience, tricks of the trade, little recipes that work sometimes but not others, and a bunch of other things that have nothing to do with logic. And so artificial intelligence researchers thought, well, if that's the case, well, let's just then make interviews of actual experts. For instance, we're going to write an artificial intelligence program that diagnoses medical diseases. Let's have a bunch of doctors, interview them to death while they are making their diagnosis, steal the rules of thumb from their bodies and transfer them to the machine. This is what is called knowledge engineering. Knowledge engineers do just that. They design interviewing situations with actual real experts. They lure the experts by telling them, you're going to be immortalized, man. All your rules of thumb are going to become part of this machine, and it's like you. Only he's not going to die. And so the guys go crazy over that, and yes, take my rules of thumb. So now they have a bunch of rules of thumb, and they, again, put them into the machine as finished symbols. Again, it's a top-down approach. You start with the finished structure, which is logically connected statements, plus heuristic rules for combining them, and then you try to work yourself down to what the secret or the essence of intelligence is. Expert systems did work better than artificial intelligence machines that operated solely on the basis of logic, but still they are like idiot savants. They are very good in their own specific field, but they have nothing that you could think of as an emergent property of intelligence. They do not come up with their own things. The opposite approach, the bottom-up approach, the approach in which you try to synthesize intelligence and you try to make intelligence an emergent property of a population, is called connectionism. Connectionism is not as well known as classical artificial intelligence, because in the war for defense funds in the 1960s, the classical artificial intelligence, specifically Minsky and Papert, wrote a paper that completely buried the connectionist approach, at least for 10 years. When it was finally resurrected at the beginning of the 80s, it began with a new, I'll explain you what it is in a second. It acquired new vigor, and now it's a very strong challenger in the field of artificial intelligence. A connectionist device, unlike an artificial intelligence device, a classical artificial intelligence device that operates with ready-made symbols, has no symbols whatsoever. You don't program a neural net. A neural net is a connectionist device. You train it like you would train an animal. That is, if you're, for instance, if the task the neural net is supposed to perform is face recognition, you don't put into it symbols for noses and eyes and variations of angles and stuff. You simply expose it to the face in a training period, and then it'll by itself recognize that face. Now, how does it do this? Instead of having programs, it has all the digamos, the recipes and stuff that it needs to work is coded into the strengths. Okay, let me just back up a little bit. The typical classical artificial intelligence setup is one big computer with one big memory and one big CPU and a lot of symbols ready-made thrown into it. The classical connectionist device is the opposite. It's a bunch of stupid computers that can do only extremely simple tasks, but that are interconnected with each other in a rather rich pattern. The connections between the little stupid computers can vary in strength, and all that happens when you run one of these computers is that some of the units here try to excite or inhibit other of the units, and therefore only like inhibition and excitation patterns travel around the thing. It's a completely dynamical device. And then the dynamical device settles into an attractor or settles into another attractor. And by settling into a particular configuration, which is emergent because it's stabilized by an attractor, in other words, when you expose it to the face over and over and again, it just settles into an attractor. And whenever in other words, you expose it to the face once and it goes into this thing, it probably doesn't settle into anything. Expose it to the face again, it continues having this dynamical activity and it doesn't settle yet into anything. After several trials, it finally finds an attractor. It's like a probing device again, finds its own stability, and then whenever you present it with that face again, it'll find its own attractor again. Now, this is starting to sound a little technical, but the main point of it is that, for instance, when they analyze a neural net, neural nets can not only recognize patterns they have been exposed to, they can recognize patterns that are similar. That is, they can generalize from one particular pattern to a family of patterns. And when you actually go and analyze just exactly what micro features of the pattern the network extracted, the micro features it extracted are normally totally non-obvious to the designer. In other words, are not the kinds of things that the designer would have put in ready built. But the network itself comes up with what micro features of the face it's going to store in order to be able to recognize it again. Again, that's emergent behavior. That's the type of thing that artificial life and connectionist artificial intelligence is all about. You know, it's like, surprise me. That's what the designer says to the machine. It's like, I want to be surprised. I'm going to put a few things here, and I want emergent properties to come out of this, of the very dynamics of the thing without my intervention. And the hallmark of a good experiment is how surprised the designer is. In this case, neural nets are performing tasks that our classical artificial intelligence would have found extremely hard to perform, because again, it did very poorly at anything that meant, everything that we humans do very simply, or even dogs, or like higher mammals do very simply, like pattern recognition. Classical artificial intelligence machines couldn't do at all. Now I sort of like sort of painted the picture with brush strokes here. I mean, with broad strokes. There's more to the picture, but I'm not going to go into many of the details. The idea is that perhaps in the future, we as designers, whether we're architects, economists, linguists, or whatever, will be able to track these attractors that exist in reality using virtual environments. Now, this is something that it's been done by artisans and craftsmen through the ages without necessarily them knowing that that's what they were doing. Let me just give you an example. Besides the concept of an attractor, the other key concept from nonlinear dynamics is the concept of a bifurcation. A bifurcation is a critical point at which one attractor or one set of attractors changes into another set of attractors. The typical example of a bifurcation is what is called a phase transition. For instance, the transition from a gas to a liquid, or from a liquid to a solid. Although in the case of solids and liquids, the stabilization does not occur via attractors. The example will suffice for the moment right now. The whole idea is this. When you have a gas, its structure is stabilized via certain kinds of attractors. You change the temperature a little bit, nothing happens. Change the temperature a little bit, nothing. But at a very sharp point, the moment you cross that bifurcation, the attractors change from one type to another, and now you have the liquid state. Again, keep changing the temperature, nothing happens, but at a critical point, it changes into water. It changes into solid. That these points are perfectly precise should be obvious from the fact that we still mark our thermometers by the bifurcations of water. 0 centigrade, 0 degrees of, not in Fahrenheit, but in centigrades, is the point at which water solidifies or becomes ice. The next mark in our thermometer is the moment water becomes a gas, like around 90 degrees or something, at sea level. That is an extra detail we don't need to think of, to concern with ourselves right now. The idea is that these points exist objectively, that always occur at the exact same moment of intensity. The intensity can be temperature, as in the case of the transitions I just told you. The transition can be speed. For instance, when a plane reaches the speed of sound, a bifurcation occurs, and if that plane cannot immediately increase the amount of energy that's supplying to its engine, it'll crash. That's why so many pilots in the 1940s crashed against the sound barrier. The sound barrier was nothing but a bifurcation in the dynamical behavior of a plane, or rather the dynamical behavior of the dynamical system formed by a plane and the air surrounding it. At a precise point, it crossed the bifurcation and entered a different regime where other attractors govern the dynamics, and if it couldn't adapt to that, it crashed. The bifurcations can be, and the intensity doesn't have to be speed or temperature. It can be pressure, can be volume, can be density, and so on. For instance, one physicist thinks that instead of thinking of humanity as climbing up the ladder of progress, that is going from hunter nomads and then discovering, we as designers, whether we're architects, economists, linguists, or whatever, will be able to track these attractors that exist in reality using virtual environments. Now, this is something that it's been done by artisans and craftsmen through the ages without necessarily them knowing that that's what they were doing. Let me just give you an example. Besides the concept of an attractor, the other key concept from nonlinear dynamics is the concept of a bifurcation. A bifurcation is a critical point at which one attractor or one set of attractors changes into another set of attractors. The typical example of a bifurcation is what is called a phase transition. For instance, the transition from a gas to a liquid, or from a liquid to a solid. Although in the case of solids and liquids, the stabilization does not occur via attractors. The example will suffice for the moment right now. The whole idea is this. When you have a gas, its structure is stabilized via certain kinds of attractors. You change the temperature a little bit, nothing happens. Change the temperature a little bit, nothing. But at a very sharp point, the moment you cross that bifurcation, the attractors change from one type to another, and now you have the liquid state. Again, keep changing the temperature, nothing happens, but at a critical point, it changes into water. It changes into solid. That these points are perfectly precise should be obvious from the fact that we still mark our thermometers by the bifurcations of water. 0 centigrade, 0 degrees of, not in Fahrenheit, but in centigrades, is the point at which water solidifies or becomes ice. The next mark in our thermometer is the moment water becomes a gas, like around 90 degrees or something, at sea level. That is an extra detail we don't need to think of, to concern with ourselves right now. The idea is that these points exist objectively, that always occur at the exact same moment of intensity. The intensity can be temperature, as in the case of the transitions I just told you. The transition can be speed. For instance, when a plane reaches the speed of sound, a bifurcation occurs, and if that plane cannot immediately increase the amount of energy that's supplying to its engine, it'll crash. That's why so many pilots in the 1940s crashed against the sound barrier. The sound barrier was nothing but a bifurcation in the dynamical behavior of a plane, or rather the dynamical behavior of the dynamical system formed by a plane and the air surrounding it. At a precise point, it crossed the bifurcation and entered a different regime where other attractors govern the dynamics, and if it couldn't adapt to that, it crashed. The bifurcations can be, and the intensity doesn't have to be speed or temperature. It can be pressure, can be volume, can be density, and so on. For instance, one physicist thinks that instead of thinking of humanity as climbing up the ladder of progress, that is going from hunter nomads and then discovering agriculture and the agricultural revolution, now we're better off, now we're a better humanity, and then discovering the state, as in Mesopotamia or Egypt, and now ruling, codifying all the rules in writing and so on, and now we are like climbing up the ladder of progress, and then we discover democracy and so on. What this physicist says, and is very plausible, is that in fact all those transitions were phase transitions that human biomass, the pure jelly stuff you see here, when bunched together in sufficient density, undergoes by itself. That is, nomad hunter-gatherers, which we lived as hunter-gatherers for millions of years. We spent 90% of our evolution as hominids, as hunter-gatherers, were like a gas, in the sense that they lived in tribes or clans of 50 or so, which lived approximately 70 miles apart. Now, considering that a human can only walk 25 miles in one day, if members of this tribe walked 25 miles and 25 miles, they never met. They had to walk more than one day in order to establish connections. The result was that these little bands of humans very rarely transacted with each other. They were like a cloud of gas, in which molecules don't even collide because there's so much space between them. Then, for a variety of reasons, the end of the Ice Age, which again is another bifurcation, which created wild grasses that could be domesticated, they came together, and now you have an increase in density, and the first villages aroused. But again, it was just like a point in the density of an agglomeration of humans. As these agglomerations began growing, there's another transition point at around 2,500 human beings, very densely packed, that a central state becomes almost like a crystallization. Like everything becomes crystallized, it becomes regulated. Everything acquires like a grid in which like everything is codified, and humanity becomes mineralized in a way, in that it starts building its stone monuments and stone pyramids and stone buildings for its institutions. Now, whether this, the theory that this physicist proposes is actually a little more elaborate than what I'm just saying. I'm not going to go into the details. The idea is that if you think of these transitions as phase transitions, as bifurcations in humanity, as human biomass going from one attractor to another attractor to another attractor, then progress doesn't exist. We're not climbing up a ladder of progress. The motion of history is not vertical, but a horizontal search for attractors. As it happens, we have only found 3 or 4, if you include the nomads of the steppes, which had a completely different form of organization. But how many other attractors there exist for society to organize itself around? We probably will never know, particularly if the entrenched idea of progress continues to put blind us to the possibility that, in fact, the history of humanity is an exploration of a horizontal realm, and that we've only explored 3 attractors, and that there may exist many other possibilities, many other dynamical combinations of human beings, which may be less oppressive than a state, not as gaseous, not as ethereal as a nomad, as a hunter-gatherer, and yet viable, and yet stabilizable. Now, if you now imagine that we put a sort of like artificial life or artificial history experiment together in an environment in which we combine population thinking, we combine nonlinear dynamics, and we combine a little bit of connectionism, that is to give each one of those individual entities kind of like an intentionality, then we could probably start playing out scenarios and discover if there are other attractors that are possible for humanity. Other forms of organization that are equally stable, that is robust against change, that will last, and yet not as oppressive as the ones that we've discovered so far. Again, this is one idea that would not even seem possible if we think of humanity as climbing up a ladder of progress, because, hey, this is it. We got here, and this is the best we can do, you know. We were bad, then we were better, then we were best. This is it, you know. And obviously it isn't. And so what other possibilities are there that we have not even seen because we have not been able to synthesize those intuitions in ourselves? That might be another possible use for virtual environments. There's one use that I would like to mention here in connection with architecture, which is as a design tool. Again, I already mentioned it slightly when I said the genetic algorithm allows you to breed solutions to problems. If instead of those problems being computer programming problems, we imagine them as architectural problems, problems of circulations, of flow of people in a building, problems of the arrangement of space in new ways that we cannot right now see, we might be able to use a genetic algorithm to do that. One way of approaching this would be something like this. Several million years ago, what used to be just jelly, kind of mollusk type creatures suddenly became mineralized. That is, vertebrates appeared on the planet. Bone was discovered as a material. Now, bone as a material is a wonderful material. We've just began to rediscover the possibilities with fiberglass and with a bunch of new composites that are right now transforming the material science. The possibilities of taking a matrix of glue and putting very strong either metallic, carbon, or plastic fibers in it and then letting it gel. Of course, concrete is a little bit like that, since you are actually adding a mixture of gravel with cement, and the whole thing is a little bit of a heterogeneous mixture that hardens and acquires emergent properties. But the exploration of this has just begun. However, nature found composites a long time ago, and in fact has found an enormous amount of materials that we don't even know, that we don't even know exactly how they function. Like, for instance, the new ceramics that are revolutionizing the world of material science right now, the new ceramics that you can probably already see them in like watches and things like that, or like on the body of the space shuttle, are very strong, but at the same time very brittle, in the sense that they are not elastic enough to support big loads or like sudden loads. Teeth, however, are just the ceramic, only it's not brittle. There is a structural design of teeth, of the material itself, that was discovered again through a process of blind probing in search for the correct attractors that took millions of years to evolve, but it evolved. So we have a lot to learn from the materials that nature found by itself. Now, several million years ago then, we acquired a skeleton. About 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, depending on what you consider the first city, we acquired an exoskeleton. If vertebrates are a form in which the jelly protein material that makes animals mineralize itself by acquiring a calcium, very mineral backbone, then when we began surrounding ourselves with stone or with mud-made bricks, or bricks made out of mud, we acquired, it was like a second mineralization. Humanity, now in this case human populations, acquired an exoskeleton. Now, it would be an interesting project to create a genetic algorithm that searched for exoskeletons, that searched the space of attractors out there for possible configurations of exoskeleton that we cannot even imagine right now. In other words, virtual environments could also become designing tools, not only, again, for aesthetics, and not just for solutions of practical problems, although, of course, architecture is right in the middle. I mean, it's half aesthetics, half solution of practical problems. But the idea is that it would be a new approach. The human is not being taken out of the decision-making process. The human is still there because it is in the human, in the fleshy stuff, and all the neural networks we have in our brains, that these intuitions get synthesized. Without the human observer seeing what happens in these populations driven by selection and variation, there would be nothing really happening there. So it's really as if now the computer and the human have become a synergistic whole. An entity with emergent properties, instead of what the tendency of particularly military thinkers is to take the humans completely out of the loop and create autonomous computers. So there are, in other words, even though the tendency behind the development of computers has been towards centralization of power and centralization of decision-making and taking humans out of the decision-making loop, that's not the only possibility. The other possibility is obviously to make humans and machines into a synergistic whole. A first step in that direction was taken when hackers created the Apple computer. At the time the Apple computer first came out in 1980, no one believed that anyone would need a personal computer, and no one believed that could become a whole industry. The personal computer came out not, and this is, most of you probably already know, not out of the corporate world, but out of the world of, out of the margins, people at the margins. Both, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs were, hippies. And, they sold illegal devices called blue boxes to make, illegal phone calls to the phone and so on. So they were not at all your corporate type. It was precisely as if humans became probing devices. And this brings me to a point that I wanted to make before, and I come back to this. Even though virtual environments can allow us for the first time to become these probing heads and look for better attractors for our designs, for our society, etc., the idea that we needed a sensual type of knowledge to track attractors is not new. It might be made better and easier to do via virtual environments, but in fact it has been with us since the development of metallurgy. In ancient Greece and before, the only ones that practiced metallurgy, the blacksmiths, were the scum of society. People despised blacksmiths. They loved the stuff they made. They loved to wear the jewels, and they loved the swords, and they loved the stuff. But they despised the whole idea of someone spending all day by the fire, melting metals, and then recrystallizing them, and tracking bifurcations, tracking the melting point of a metal, and using the fire to bring about that bifurcation and to bring about a new set of attractors to appear, and then learning that if you cross the bifurcation fast by quenching the sword into water, you get one effect. If you cross the bifurcation very slowly by annealing the thing, you got another effect. And material science is a science of this century, which means that we spent 20 centuries and all the centuries before Christ tracking the behavior of materials, tracking the attractors that stabilize their different configurations by ear, by smell, by a sensual kind of knowledge, because no formal knowledge of this existed till this century. When in fact this century discovered fracture mechanics, that is, began to understand what happens inside a material that makes it what it is, it was by actually applying nonlinear dynamics to the thing. So even though, and this is my main point, even though population thinking, nonlinear dynamics, connectionism, and all the different disciplines that I'm just been telling you about are very new and are for the first time opening these new vistas of what the world really is like, artisans and craftsmen knew in their guts this long time ago, because they had to develop that sensual knowledge that that interaction with matter and the materials on a sensual basis a long time ago. They discover alloying. They discover, for instance, that if you combine tin with copper in the precise proportions, you get bronze. And that if you measure the tensile strength of copper, say it's 5, and you measure the tensile strength of tin, say it's 2, and you add them, it's 5 by plus 2, 7, and then you measure the tensile strength of bronze, which is 10 or 12, there's like a surplus of strength. Where the hell did it come from? Emergent properties. It was an emergent property of alloying. Alloys were discovered centuries before Christ by a process of experimentation, of exploration, of allowing matter to have its say in the actual process, of sort of like confronting matter as if it was a living thing, as if it was something that you can push it and it'll get to one set of attractors, push it the other way, it'll get to another set of attractors, and so on. This whole thing disappeared around the 19th century when, starting in military armories and arsenals, humans began to discipline matter, to make matter, to force matter to be homogeneous, to force matter to have the exact type of behavior they want us to have, homogeneous, standard, normal. And therefore, now you could create, by perfecting foundry techniques, by perfecting the metallurgical techniques in a standardized way, they were able to generate iron and steel that you could tell what properties it was going to have from the beginning. But they had lost, and we lost something very important back then. As a matter of fact, right now I'm telling you about these things, and it seems like, what the hell is this guy talking about? And this was normal 200 years ago. That means we've lost something. We've lost a sense of a sensual way of tracking bifurcations and attractors. We've lost a sense of interacting with matter and energy in their own terms. We've lost all that. Virtual environments, I believe, can allow us to regain that, can become like training devices for us to redevelop that as architects, as politicians, as economists, as linguists, doesn't matter. Because you're in all of these fields, you're confronted with the exact same thing. Population thinking, nonlinear dynamics, and in our case, in the case of intentional entities as ourselves, connectionism. That is, you're confronted with the fact that matter and energy have a creative power of their own. Now, and I'm going to stop soon to get some questions from you. One of the most amazing, you can imagine that the planet Earth is divided into different areas, some of which are more linear, more stratified, as I call it, and some of them which are more self-organized. Everything that's land, everything that's the crust of the Earth, that most of us consider reality, is just that, a crust, a hardened part, a tiny little layer that's happened to have hardened with mountains and so on. But the real action is the huge lava flows that are running underneath, that are self-organized lava flows, like self-organized conveyor belts, that are, of course, transporting the continents and making them clash against one another. We adore stability. We adore the Himalayas, for instance. That's our symbol of permanence. You and your grandsons are going to go, and these things are still going to be here. However, the Himalayas are just a wrinkle that's being produced by the clash of India with Central Asia. A clash that's going on right now. The Himalayas are still going on right now, 1 millimeter a year. You can see that, and certainly for military purposes, say for the purposes of invading Tibet, it wouldn't matter. But they are going on 1 millimeter a year. And they are going on because the real action is happening in things that flow underneath this thing. And yet, we adore this stuff, the solid little crusty thing. And we don't see what's going on underneath it. The same thing happens in the ocean, for instance. In the ocean, there's a million different self-organizing phenomena. A hurricane, for instance, is a self-assembled steam engine, literally a steam engine. When you say, for example, class struggle is the motor of history, the word motor there is being used as a metaphor. But when you say a hurricane is a motor, the word motor is not being used as a metaphor. It's being used in the sense in which an engineer uses the word. It fits a particular diagram. It has a reservoir of heat, circulates heat through a Carnot cycle, and it uses a form of thermal difference to run the whole thing. It is a motor, except that it's a motor that puts itself together. Now, just as hurricanes are motors, wind circuits, such as the trade winds or the monsoon or the westerlies, are self-organized conveyor belts. It was sailors in the 15th and 16th centuries that knew how to track these winds, like Christopher Columbus, that in fact changed the face of the planet as we know it. It was not like, okay, well, I'm going to go to that place. No, it was like a matter of knowing the wind, of knowing the currents, of having like a familiarity with self-organizing processes on Earth and being able to track and follow instead of imposing a rational order on them. That's the way America got discovered. That's the way, in a way, capitalism got going, since it was the silver from South America and Mexico that fueled capitalism in Europe. That's what actually transformed this millennium into what we know it right now. It was the tracking, the sensual tracking of sailors tracking the winds. Now, that sense, and I'm giving you all these examples just so that I don't want you to keep just the image of the metallurgist or the craftsman. I mean, this thing happens all over the place. That sense of confronting an active, creative matter and energy, whether it's in the form of winds or in the form of lavas or in the form of metals that you melt, we've lost. And we need to recover it. And the only way to, and we lost it, and right now it's hard to recover because a lot of entrenched ideas are out there not allowing us to see this. Just as the idea that good guys finish last had to be debunked, had to be dislodged from its dominant position, and it was done through a virtual environment, I believe if we use virtual environments properly, we will be able to retrain ourselves and redevelop this sort of like sensual experience of matter and energy. Okay? If you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer some. It's going to be the first one. Okay. Well, that's a good question. I mean, on the one hand, you would have to consider, yeah, well, the question was that if society is indeed stabilized and its dynamics are indeed governed by attractors, what can we as individuals do to move society from one attractor to the next? Well, the first answer to the question is this. Whenever a bifurcation occurs, whenever like attractors are completely deterministic things. Once you're trapped into an attractor, that's it. You're trapped. It's completely deterministic. There's no free will there. However, whenever a bifurcation occurs in this is in society or in metals or in whatever, tiny little fluctuations that occur at the exact moment of the bifurcation can affect the outcome in a disproportionate way. In other words, by tiny little fluctuations, and I mean fluctuations, we are little fluctuations in society. As long as you know how to recognize the transition point and plug yourself in and push in the right direction at that precise critical point, your activity becomes multiplied and amplified. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Armies, to go back to the military, also have gone through phase transitions of this sort. The armies of Frederick the Great, for instance, in the 18th century, were a huge phalanx that was a solid wall. In that period, you didn't have rifles, you didn't have the ability to shoot someone like this. You know, you loaded your guns, your rifles from on top, and by the time you did this, I mean, the bullet was like a mess. And when you shot it, it fly like that. So the tactics of that time was to have huge walls of soldiers all shooting at the same time. And then one of those was bound to hit the enemy, right? So it was like a solid wall. It was a solid, and everybody thought solidly. Then came Napoleon, and of course other people that came before him that created these ideas and broke down the army into a much more fluid entity. He, for instance, instead of having one big army with its own artillery, cavalry, and infantry, he broke it down into mini armies called divisions. Each one of which had its own artillery, its own infantry, and its own cavalry. That allowed him to create new types of strategies in which each one of these divisions travel along a different route and converge at the point of the battle. Well, to make a long story short, it beat the shit out of everybody else. Of course, he eventually lost, but the first few years it was a revolution in warfare. He had liquefied armies. He had introduced another thing. Now, Napoleon himself really didn't do anything. Napoleon, all he was this little fluctuation, and the bifurcation was the French Revolution. The French Revolution happened because of all kinds of dynamical causes out of the control of any one specific human. It was probably a population density reaching a certain degree of intensity. It was the contradictions or the conflicts between rural and urban life as the population arose, also reaching the contradictions and the conflicts reaching a point of critical intensity, a bunch of points of critical intensity that unleashed sort of like a turbulent period in human history. But Napoleon was there and saw it. He saw that the bifurcation was occurring. He saw that if he plugged himself in at that point, he could push the organization of an army from one attractor, the attractor that defined Frederick the Great armies, into another attractor of his own making. Now, most people would think, well, Napoleon invented this new concept. He didn't. The concepts were floating around. What's his name? Another French guy, 20 years before Napoleon, had already created the idea. I just forgot his name right now. So the ideas were floating in the air, much as it happens in human history a lot. Calculus was invented by Newton and Leibniz at the exact same time. In other words, the evolutionary theory was not invented by Darwin. Evolutionary ideas were in the air. All he did was plug himself into, saw that the ideas were reaching a critical point, plug himself in and make epistemological fields or whatever go into a new attractor, population thinking. So individuals can and do play a role in history, but at bifurcation. And by actually developing this sense of dynamics, by actually developing a sense that society is stabilized and then goes through periods of destabilization and then stabilize itself again, and at the moment of the bifurcation you can do that. Now, how could we as individuals do this? Well, of course, the very first thing would be to create some kind of a map of attractors, to know what possibilities there are. The only way we can do that is through virtual environments. We actually need to create simulations that awaken in us intuitions as to what other possibilities of stabilization there are. Then through those virtual environments too, find out just exactly what control parameters, what intensities would have to be brought to a critical point so that society would be ready for a change. And then of course be ready to risk your ass and be there at the moment. You don't know what's going to happen. Again, we're talking about matter and energy, and us being just coagulated matter and energy that happens to be coagulated here right now. In other words, just put it even more precise, all we are is solar energy that happens to be coagulated into protein right now. Solar energy comes in, plants through photosynthesis transform it into sugars, herbivores eat the sugars, we eat the herbivores, and so all we are is that solar energy that's circulating through ecosystems in the form of a food chain. So as these little coagulations, we really shouldn't have any saying on what's going on. And yet, we have intentionality. We have neural networks that can recognize, that can put patterns together. Again, I'm not talking about rationality. I'm talking about this sense of following patterns and tracking attractors. And so if with artificial aids, such as virtual environments, we could find just exactly what bifurcations society is capable of undergoing, and how one can be that little fluctuation that at the very moment of the critical transition pushes the thing in one or another direction, then you acquire quite a bit of free will, quite a bit of power. But that's because the very dynamics of the thing is amplifying your little push. Just as it amplified the little push that Napoleon did, or the little push that, that other critical people in history have done. And I believe that, in a way, they also had this sense of how to put people together. How to, for instance, let me give you an example. Whenever two different systems are in a periodic attractor, for instance, us that have a periodic wake and sleep cycle, or the menstrual cycle, or any kind of periodic attractor, whenever two different creatures have periodic attractors, they can entrain with one another, which means that their cycles can begin pulsating at the exact same beat. This happens with amoebas, this happens with yeast cells, this happens as they found out in World War II when they put tons of women together in factories. Happens to women's menstrual cycles. In other words, periodic attractors can entrain to one another. Now, in the 16th century, Maurice of Nassau, which was a famous general and the general who put together the modern army in the war between the Dutch and Spain, figured that if you have a bunch of soldiers going through the same repetitive drill, loading, aiming, shooting, loading, aiming, shooting, if you make them into oscillators, they can train with one another. They develop a kind of street war. In fact, we still see that on movies. The Marines running around singing the same song. And so like training with one another. Now, I doubt that Maurice of Nassau knew what entrainment was, but he knew that he had tapped a reservoir of social. He knew the moment, in his gut, he knew that he had actually done a dynamic event. He had actually pushed his troops into a new attractor, which like the disparate periodic cycles were now going like that. So again, it's a matter of recognizing the dynamics, of knowing, of smelling this dynamics, and pushing things in the right direction. It's not a matter of rational planning at all. It's more of, as Jane Jacobs has called it, an aesthetics of drift, of knowing how to drift with matter and energy, and look out for attractors and bifurcation. That's an ability we completely lost, so I wouldn't blame you if you thought that I've been sounding like a complete New Age dude or something. But it's absolutely nothing to do with it. Absolutely nothing to do with spirits or ghosts or mysticism or anything. Sounds like that because we've been normalized, standardized, disciplined for 200 years now. We have been made to think that in fact all that matters is planning and rationally behaving in a rational way, when in fact that was never the case. That's like a new thing. More question? If you're stabilized by a chaotic attractor, from the point of view of an outside observer, you're going to look unstable. But in fact, you are stable. As I said before, the heart, the rhythm of the heart, if you take the cells of a heart and put it in a little dish, they keep beating. In other words, all you have there is like cells that beat by themselves. And you put them together in an organ, and they can train with one another and beat to the same beat. Now, we tend to think of that as stabilized cyclically. But in fact, if you measure an electrocardiogram, there's nothing of a cycle. There's more of a chaotic attractor. And in fact, the moment your heart starts becoming plugged or like it's about to have a heart attack, then it becomes periodic. The reason why nature discovered that in its blind probing for attractors was that an attractor that effectively pins the dynamics of a system to a small set of possibilities and yet allows the system to explore that small set over and over, from the outside, it's going to look like unstable, but in fact, it's even more stable than if it was fixed and rigid. It's like a dynamic stability. Now that is what I think society would need. And let me just give you a very concrete example of that. One of the questions that have obsessed my mind forever and ever is the question, why not China? Why didn't China win the millennium? When at the beginning of the millennium, we had invented gunpowder, paper money, compass, clocks, printing press, everything that's supposed to be the West, what made the West take off. Now, why didn't China take off then? In fact, there was even a form of primitive capitalism already going on by the year 1000. The Chinese had already reached the Indian Ocean in the year 1430. Before the Portuguese were trying to go around Africa and discover Asia, the Chinese could have discovered us. Why didn't they? One of the reasons is that their cities were different than cities in the West. Their cities were pinned to a static attractor in which the state dominated merchants and dominated and like taxed everyone so much that merchant creativity couldn't get off, entrepreneurial creativity couldn't get off the ground. Whereas in Venice, Genoa, Amsterdam, of that same period, the dynamics of the towns were much more like a chaotic attractor. It was like an aesthetics of thrift. It was like, there's a very precise description of this process by Jane Jacobs book in terms of import substitution and so on. I'm not even going to the technical details. I'm just going to leave it at this level, but there is a very concrete explanation of why the dynamics of Western towns were much more active than the dynamics of either Cairo, Delhi, or Peking. Eventually, even though the inventions had been created there, the dynamic that took them up and sort of like in a kind of a vortex and sort of like, like amplifying it into what we became today, were the urban dynamics of Western towns. So, to an observer back then, Western towns would have seemed like they were going to self-destruct. They were doing China. China was the model of stability, the model of a self-contained society that didn't need anything else. It was perfect up to the 19th century with the Opium Wars, when England forced itself into China. The Chinese didn't even want to trade. And they gave us porcelain and silk in exchange for silver. They didn't have fucking cotton shirts that the British were making. The British had to force themselves into China through the Opium Wars and so on, but because it was such a self-contained society. However, that self-containment, that stability is over. Because only those societies that had a chaotic attractor, again, this is going to be spelled out, propelled, again, it's not progress, it's propelled the dynamics of the whole project. There's much more to the story than just that, but just to answer your question, systems that, for instance, artists do not seem at all stable, and yet they come up with, they have enough creativity to come up with the focus for long periods of time and creating many new things, many paintings, many different musical pieces, many different architectural designs in their instability. But I would think more in terms of they are stabilized, yet like a chaotic attractor. Like an attractor that allows them to explore all the possibilities of a small region of their dynamics. I mean, if the attractor allowed you to explore all the possibilities, then you would look chaotic. But a chaotic attractor pins you and yet allows you to explore a small set of possibilities. So don't think that what looks unstable is really unstable. Certain things are really unstable. But when you see a person that seems unstable and yet manages to produce a certain amount of coherent work, the guy is not unstable. It's more like his or her own dynamics are being governed by a chaotic attractor. That's a hypothesis, but in the case of the urban towns, this can be worked out to very precise detail. Next one, another question over there. artificial connectionist neural nets already seem to be possessing intentionality. You take a neural net, you show it a pattern, micro features of the pattern it extracts it comes up with its own micro features. In other words, you would think, as a designer of a neural net, hey, concentrate on the nose, and the eyes, and the bone structure or something. The neural net comes up with micro features of the face that if only knows why it actually did that. And yet you can recognize that face from many different angles, from different lights, and so on, which is something that classical artificial intelligence could not possibly do. So yes, I mean the moment, and this propel like arms race, for instance, can end up in autonomous weapons, can end up in killer weapons. That would be one possibility. I mean, there are already really stupid, one-man tanks. I have the pictures in my book. They are not particularly impressive. They're just like sort of neck that sticks out. They have a television camera, so they can, they can see through a television camera, which means that we can take a black and white frame, take advantage of the fact that in a black and white frame, discontinuities between objects appear at discontinuities between gray levels, and therefore they can find contours, they can pick those contours in a three-dimensional template and sort of recognize what the objects are, and then therefore see what's in the frame. Of course, I doubt that there's an actual tell frame from above at this point, and they probably they don't reach them because they're still on everything. But and then when they have shows for like top brass, which they're showing the thing, and the guys are trying to negotiate a sharp 90-degree turn, and like topple over and stuff. They look like stupid Terminator things, but they are Terminators. They are here. And fortunately, the experience of the melting of the Soviet Union to me that was another piece of position that I was not expecting at all. And all of a sudden, hoping to melt their way, took off some steam from arms race, but an arms race is a healthy feedback loop, which increase on one side, reduce on the other, reduce on the other. It's a dynamical system. So I have no doubt that thinking robots with this person in place of humans will appear. So it is more important that artists and non-smart people of all kinds develop a new relationship with machines. Because if we don't, they will replace us. And if we manage to become a synergistic whole with this machine, then those stupid little robots won't really be doing anything. I mean, we'll become more than the robots. But if we don't, I mean, it's interesting, the future is full with dangers and positive things. What's actually going to happen is going to depend on whether we know how to steer this dynamics in the right direction.
1 or 2 years ago, there was a study where the United States was trying to figure out how to get rid of the use of
urban infrastructure, and the future buyers would actually be sent back to the other side.
But you think not in terms of going back to classic changes, in other words, then versus because we're at one point we were invertebrates, could we revert back to not being invertebrates?
Okay, that's a good question. There are certain, even though the change itself, the phase transition itself could happen, a lot has been built around the vertebrate design that makes it almost irreversible, in the sense that too much has been invested in terms of design and jelly, protein around the bones and so on to make this thing good. And also, evolution has a kind of a ratchet device, precisely, which is speciation. The moment species say that the moment a new species is born, which is born when a population becomes reproductively isolated from another, that is when a horse cannot breed with a donkey anymore because the product of mule is sterile and therefore genes don't flow well. The moment that happens, all the horse traits become frozen. In other words, evolution cannot go backwards. I mean, there's a certain irreversibility to the problem. Even though it was based on human beings who thought they had enough to discover agriculture 10,000 years ago. Compared to the amount of time we've been in the planet as hunter-gatherers, that's only like 1% of the planet. In our hunting, let alone the history of monkeys. So we've been in this phase for 500 generations almost. There's no evolutionary change could have happened in 500 before we have not lost ourselves. That there are enormous vested interests, institutions which build things, and enormous amount of concentration of power from corporations, military, and so on. Activists are actually, I don't know what that is. That's an action. They don't want us to go anywhere. We want to become standardized, normal, everybody homogenized, as opposed to, what I was saying before about comparison between Cairo, Peking, or Delhi with Venice. But like in Venice, heterogeneity was allowed. As a matter of fact, Venice was a way of as a city, as an urban, dynamical system, was a way of articulating heterogeneous elements as such, diverse elements as such, without homogenizing. In Peking, in Cairo, in Delhi, the caste system, they're much more stratified, much more homogenous. And so heterogeneity eventually won. However, the moment we crossed the 19th century, we became just like they were. We're becoming increasingly homogenous, increasingly standardized, increasingly normal. Of course, artists are fighting that to death. They want their own individuality, their own singularity, their own uniqueness to be recognized. And so, as long as there's that resistance, we have hope. And of course, we have even more hope if someone came up with a map of attractors that told us, where to go. But I believe that is possible. I believe that cartographers of the future will use virtual environments to actually create these maps, and show us new possibilities. Yeah? For instance, in the case of architecture, that's how I gave you the example, right? You would have a bunch of programs, a population of programs that reproduces with variability, and the artist himself will be the selection pressure, will be the breeder. The programs that win in the competition, or the programs that become selected, are those that resolve, say that at the end of each program has the mission of each one of the little programs to build in 3D space a particular architectural motif, say a staircase, or the wall, or a roof of a certain kind. Now, what you would be doing there would be reading this program that would in turn be creating architectural motifs, and the artist would be steering this machine, seeing the result in 3D, checking out what the new structure is like, it's not good, then set the evolution running again. Now I'm going to change this or those parameters. And then you see what the results are, and then you're steering this population of those programs that end up creating architectural motifs until they result in the design that you find easy. No, I've been ranting against rationality all night. No, it would not be a rational pattern. Rationalization as a process is a military origin, believe it or not. And either it's of the state origin. The very first use of a rational procedure to follow and determine the fact was in Greek courts in the 5th century. The moment eyewitness testimony came, and this is an idea like Michel Foucault, the moment eyewitness testimony became valid in court, a whole set of rational procedures, which were before Aristotle or Plato or any of the earliest critics of philosophy, rational procedures to find the truth, the truth of learning, came again into a process of selection and so on in Greek institutions. That was the origin of rationality. Again, you have to get rid of the idea that rationality comes with a package. It doesn't. The essence of humans is not to be rational. I'm not saying that rationality doesn't help you. I've been trying to be rational for a while. But at the same time, that is not our essence. We don't have it. We're constructions. We get it by natural selection. We were as good as the dark really could be here at the rhythm. If that's the theory I have not to the diamond, what is the probability? We really rational. It's all a very contingent process, depending on very contingent events. Now, rationality as a project of rationalizing society, that's a much more modern thing, which I gave to like the military, at the moment, the guy that I was talking about before, the one that did that discipline and drill, those disciplines that were revived in the 5th and 16th centuries from Roman methods, then became exported to the civilian world, business school, naval hospitals, to look at the whole way of looking at the world that began in military institutions, were exported to the civilian population, all their institutions, and then they came to believe that that's what we are. But that's not. And so, how do we, it's like the instructions of the group that's in class. This is symbolism. How are we going to get one of ourselves and the virtual environments allow the functionality and non-rational power? It's also a sort of wonder, the whole sense of solitude, the whole sense of being surprised by an animal. It becomes like a more joyful, sensual interaction that's not planned, but like a sense of rhythm. Knowing what rhythm is all by our hands. Again, it sounds terrible, sorry, and it's not. But, I believe that something like that could happen in the next century. At the same time, I believe that the importance of rationalization of everything has still gone on super strong. But what's going to win, I don't know. I would hope that we will.
We can let you go with that, and that if you have more questions, maybe you ask me over up here. Okay, thank you.
Where are you based?
New York City.
New York City, really? I'm doing a studio
Thanks for coming.
based in Stabilization, architecture. Alex yesterday around April 19th, I was willing to invite you.
Where will you be? Here?
Here.
Okay, well, yeah, because I have to fly all the way here.
Yeah.